molds, fungus, viruses, all some of the diseases and problems that you might encounter when you start growing microgreens on a large scale. How do you prevent those things? How do you deal with them? And how do you try and avoid them altogether? That's what this one's about. Coming up. Welcome to the Growing Microgreens podcast. I'm your host, Diego, D-I-E-G-O. This is a show all about how to grow microgreens successfully. In each episode, grower Chris Thoreau will share 10 plus years of microgreen experience giving insights for people who operate or want to operate a profitable microgreens business. We'll touch on topics such as farming challenges and struggles, sales and marketing, soil and media climate control, sanitization, and a whole lot more. As we go through this series, if you want to learn more from Chris, check out his online course using the link in the description below. For today's episode, we are talking microgreen diseases. When you start growing microgreens, a lot of issues may come up depending upon the situation in which you're growing. You may start to see molds. You may start to see fungus. You may have viral diseases that come in with the seeds. How do you deal with all those things? For example, if you get some mold on a crop, do you scrap the whole tray, or can you simply harvest around it or above it? These are all subjects that grower Chris Thoreau and I are talking about today. And this episode was actually inspired by a question that we received recently via email. Let's hear what that question was. So recently I got an email from Sagar in United Arab Emirates, and he's having some issues in their microgreen system over there. And given that this episode focuses around disease, I thought his issue would tie perfectly into what we're going to talk about today. He's having two problems, and I'll try and visually describe this as best as I can for people listening at home. He's growing pea shoots and radish, and his pea shoots, what he's seeing, if you're looking at the tray, are what would look like normal colored peas, like the light tan color with the radicals coming out, look like they would and how they should. But then in part of the tray, for about a third of the tray, they are totally black, almost like brown M&M color. And some of them are covered in what looks to be a white mold. And then he's having an issue with his radish sprouts where he is seeing little black spots, like lines on the leaves, the cotyledons, which would normally be really green. You have these pictures, you've seen it, you've kind of read his description of what he's doing. Starting with the peas, what are your thoughts looking at this?
Yeah, so as we were just sort of discussing before going live here, there's a lot of things to consider when you're seeing disease come into your system. We've talked in the past about airflow and humidity, sanitizing seeds, knowing your seed source, knowing things about your soil. So there's always a lot of things to consider when looking at disease and trying to ascertain to a degree what the likely source is, then thinking about, I think, two things. How do we deal with this now? And what's our strategy to avoid it in the future? And this pea issue, I have no doubt that if people are listening and have grown peas, they're like, oh yeah, I know that issue. I've grown a lot of peas over the years, and I would say it's the crop that I've had, I'm just really thinking of this right now, it's the crop that I've had the most disease problems with, and it is exactly this issue. You see the seeds, you'll uncover the tray and you'll see like a pocket of black seeds. And that pocket might be about as big as a quarter. In Canada, I might say it's about as big as a loonie or a toonie. And sometimes it's as big as half the tray. And what you'll notice about that is once you've uncovered the tray, it doesn't spread anymore. So it's at that point. So it's one of those things, if I uncover a tray and there's a tiny little bit there, I'm like, that's too bad, but it's not going to affect yield. And if I'm only seeing on one or two trays, I'm just like, okay, there's some disease there, but we're growing, 30 trays of peas and we're seeing, 0.2% of the trays diseased. This isn't an issue. But when you start uncovering your trays and you see half a tray and 5 of your trays have half a tray and other trays have spots of it, then you've got to start thinking about, what's going on here and what do I need to do to remedy this. So this is a fungal issue, and I find with fungal issues often it's airflow. And in Cigar's email, he talked about he's got a germination chamber in there where they do everything. And so I'm starting to think right away about what does that chamber look like. I think well sealed. I think there might be some airflow issues. He had mentioned about 80 to 85% relative humidity. That might be a little high, and they do it at 28 degrees Celsius. So, which in the food peddler system is not bad, but in this system might be too warm. Peas are a cool weather crop, even though they do well in the heat. So we want to take a look at all these things and try to get a sense of, what's going on. Now, in this case, with the image he sent, I don't know if this is how they're usually growing their peas, but the peas are on a fabric mat. And I don't know the material there, whereas we grow peas on soil. And so if we're seeing on a fabric mat and we're seeing it on soil, I'm thinking, okay, well, the mat or the soil maybe aren't the likely sources of the fungus. So we have sort of two sources to consider. One is the seed itself, and then the other is just the air. Fungal spores, for example, in the air that are getting onto the product. So it's a disease that we're bringing into the system through the seed, or a disease we're bringing into the system in another way through ventilation, or even just through our general movement. The other thing I don't know, and I'm just looking over it here, is whether or not the seeds were sanitized beforehand. And so if we add that they were sanitized, and we'll assume pretty good control of fungus, then we're starting to think, okay, this might be an atmospheric thing, or maybe a little bit from the seed, but whatever, because of our heat and our humidity, and maybe a little bit of poor airflow. There's a number of factors there. So yeah, when I look at these, in order to really help Cigar, we need a lot more information. But because we have some principles to draw from, we can start to assess the likelihood of one thing or another, and then as we get more information, start to remedy that. And what we usually do is say, well, let's start looking at some obvious things and start with those, and then if those aren't resolving the problem, let's move on to more advanced things.
How much does seeding density play into airflow? If the trays are stacked when they're germinating, is it going to matter if imagine the soil surface or the media surface is 100% covered, or if it's 50% covered? Do you think that affects disease issues at all? I have a stock answer I think I'm about to give, but I have some other thoughts as well. It makes no sense, as I think you're alluding to, that airflow would be changed by your seeding density because the trays are stacked. And so your airflow in the middle of the tray is very minimal anyways. So in this case, airflow may or may not be an issue. The other thing to consider with seeding density, and I have recommended to people in the past, say in warmer conditions, and often going from a cool spring and winter into a hotter summer, that we might want to reduce our seeding density to reduce the likelihood of disease. And I'd say there it's not so much because we're improving airflow between the seeds. It's that there's less density, there's less concentration of the seed as a food source for a pathogen, and there's a little bit more space between the seeds, so it's a little trickier for something to pass from one seed to another if there needs to be direct contact. And so different diseases will spread in different ways, and sometimes there does need to be physical contact between one part of the plant or another, or as an example with tomatoes, where you need a pathogen to splash up from the soil and get on the stem to pass on a blight or something. So there's
there's mechanisms like that, and my thinking is if you can reduce your seeding density a little bit, you can often slow down the spread of something because of that space between seeds. Not so much because of airflow. If I was thinking about airflow in this case, I might suggest having a little bit of space between stacks of trays.
Generalizing here, do you think that when it comes to peas, in your experience, you've had a lot of disease pressure with them? Is it more issues with the seed and how it's showing up for you, or is it environmental?
I would have to say, so for the food peddlers, pea is a crop that we soak overnight to induce germination. So they spend a lot of time in the water, which gives them a lot of time for a potential pathogen to thrive, even though I don't think a fungus or a mold would do that in that situation. But we also sanitize it. Like, it often soaks overnight in a sanitizer, and we do sanitize them. So the idea is if there is something present on the seed, then we're likely to control it. Now, I've seen a lot of disease on seed, but certainly more in the early days than in later days. And I'll say it's been a very long time since I've seen, half a tray or a quarter of a tray, or even anything, like the size of half the size of a dollar bill in terms of this kind of infection. So the thing that in those situations that we have changed more than anything in the production system is overall sanitation and hygiene, keeping the floor clean, washing and sanitizing trays after every use, being much more meticulous about washing hands. And so it goes back to the idea of where is this pathogen coming from? Is it being? It's always going to be introduced in some way. You're introducing everything. Microgreens are always closed systems, and so you're even introducing the atmosphere. But your seeds, your soil, your trays, your feet, your hands, they're all ways of bringing potential problems into your system. So by having a very, very good routine, and it doesn't have to be neurotic, it just has to be consistent and pretty good, you can really, really reduce that likelihood. So I might in this system say, like, hey, like, Cigar, what does your sanitation regime look like overall? How often do you take everything out of your germination chamber and wipe it down top to bottom and sanitize it completely? We do that in the food peddler's greenhouse every week. And there's no skipping weeks. You just don't do that. I kind of related back to a dentist's office or a doctor's office or a surgery. You don't sometimes autoclave your stuff after using it. You always do. Like, these things are required. So there's things like just your general routine where if you don't do them, what happens is you do get a buildup somewhere. And so it could just be something's brought in because there's more of a presence of it due to poor maintenance of the system overall.
And for people playing along at home listening to this, there's a process here, and that's what we're really trying to show is it's hard to pinpoint exactly what it is, but we're looking at the issues we can see with the information we have and saying, well, it could be this. Think about how you do this. And one of the things you mentioned is he's growing on a mat. He's not growing on soil. We can assume that mat is sterile. There's probably no disease in that because it doesn't even look like a mat made of organic material. It looks like one of those woven, like, synthetic fiber mats that he's growing on. When it comes to soil, you had an interesting example recently growing at your house where you changed your mix and you started to see disease pressure that you attributed to changing your soil mix. So in Cigar's situation, probably not coming from the media, but in your situation, it did come from the media. Can you talk about what you saw there?
Yeah, and I'll to backtrack a little bit, maybe it's coming from his media. I don't know how sterile it is. I don't know how well they're storing it. I don't know how well how it's packaged when it's shipped. And these things seem all like nitpicking, but if you think about, he's in the United Arab Emirates, if he's shipping something from, I don't know, Brazil, like there's a lot of distance for things to cover. There's a lot of opportunity for contamination. And so these are things to consider, but there's lots of stuff along the way, which is why we want really good control of things coming into our system. Now, another thing we don't know about Sagar's situation is what has changed. And when you change something and then see a change in production or disease or yield or whatever it is, we talk about causation and correlation, but when things correlate that well, we're like, okay, there's definitely some causation here. And so I'm always curious about what has changed, what was the impact, and why did that impact take place? And some things are really easy. We stopped watering and everything died. Okay, that makes sense. We watered more and things died. Oh, okay, well, we gave them too much water. So you start looking at these things, and these are the things that start to make you a very, very good grower, is you are changing things. And so you understand when things work, why they're working. And these problems that come up are really, really good ways to become a better grower. If you're a grower and you just nail things all the time, and then a couple of years down the line, something goes wrong, you're not going to have an idea of where to start. So these problems are what build our skill set. So in my case, I've grown tens of thousands of trays of sunflower and had very little disease. And when I've had it in the past, it's been, I think, again, due to poor sanitation. And I saw trays in my home system, like the whole tray was basically destroyed. And, that's hurtful to my ego, I have to say. When I pull a tray up after 3.5 days of germination and there's a whole ecology there and no really good germinating seeds, it's quite difficult to see. So often I'm like, okay, well, what's happened here? Let's do another tray and just see what happens, see if we're seeing the same thing, see what the scope is. And then I'm already thinking, like, what has changed? And in my case, what I had done is I had changed my soil mix. And I'm using a pre-mixed soil for home production. It's just easier to buy in a bale. And then I'm adding a little bit of vermiculite and I'm adding a little bit of compost. So it's changing the mix a little bit. The compost adds a bit more nutrition, and the vermiculite lightens it up a bit more and adds a little bit of nutrient exchange capacity, which we don't need to get into. But I, in a couple of batches of soil, added more compost to my usual amount. And I can't remember my thinking at the time, but I did want to bump up the organic matter content of my soil. And, this is one of the principles we talk about in sustainable agriculture, is building soil organic matter as a way of building resilience in our system. And in ground crops, this works to a degree. Too much organic matter can be a problem. So it's about having the right amount. And so what I basically did is I just, I remixed my soil. I didn't put any organic matter in it, or didn't add any compost. So I just used the premix, and the disease went away, right like that, which I had expected. And so I was able to work backwards from a change I had made and seeing what change that impact had. Now, what I might do if I wanted to really understand that, I would make up, up to 10 different mixes. And then I would do the base mix. And then I do a mix with 1% compost, 2% compost, 3% compost. Up to a certain point, I would grow replicates of these multiple trays if I had the space. And I would look for a pattern. It's like, when do I see disease coming in? When, am I seeing more growth, but a little bit of disease? And then am I seeing too much disease and not enough growth? Like, where is the sweet spot that I gain an advantage from adding organic matter or compost to the system? And so I would go through a process like that if I had the time and the space and all that stuff to understand what was happening there. So there is some processes to go through to understand those things. But the challenge with that and the lesson in that is, all I'm learning is with this mix and this compost source. And so I can't say to you 3% compost is the optimum amount in there. what I often say is there's a range from 3 to 10%, because if you're using a really nutritious, really dense compost, like maybe a worm castings compost, you probably want a really, really low percentage. Whereas if you have a compost that's a little more fibrous, not as rich, not as nutrient dense, you can go to the higher end. And so you're using multiple principles here to understand how to best build a soil mix, partially for plant growth, but also to avoid or actually prevent disease within your system. And so, yeah, so this is my experience with adding organic matter to my soil to change my growing, and seeing that it wasn't beneficial. And in fact, the mix I was using was really the perfect mix. And so, it goes back to the simple idea, if it isn't broke, don't fix it.
And seeing seeds like we're seeing here from a recently uncovered tray that are black, sunflower seeds, like you're talking about, you uncover the tray, you're seeing disease, no sprouting. At that point, they're beyond recovery. Like the tray is just, if it's high enough disease presence, it's just junk. But those seeds are never coming back at that point.
It actually depends on the disease. So these black peas, they generally do not come back. You can see in the picture I'm looking at it now, the radicals on the good peas are, we'll just call them 5 units long, and on the black peas there's either none or some that are like 1 unit long. So the best growth is about 1/5 of what it is on the good peas, and at a certain point they just don't recover, because once you uncover them and they get into this sort of process where they're sending up more of a stem, there's really no rooting in there to support that. Now, this is interesting you bring this up, because when I did have the disease in my sunflower, it's exactly the thinking. It's like the whole tray is infected. I really, they're just wasted. And I can't recall, this was in summer when I was very busy, but I remember thinking, let's see what happens. Like, can we recover these? And I maybe gave them one spray with hydrogen peroxide to control things a little bit, and then left them and kind of babied them, like gave them a bit of water, but not too much, made sure they had really good light. They were on a heating pad. They're near a window, so they're getting natural light as well as the fluorescent lights. And I was actually surprised in the sunflower how much growth I ended up getting in return. So I think it's important to recognize when you've lost a crop or a portion of a crop. And if I had like half a pea tray still growing, like I would harvest around that mold. I would leave a bit of a buffer, but if the edges are great, I would take that. It's only if something was really, really sort of spread throughout the tray and there were just little sections that were alive where I would discard something. But if I've put the seed and soil and labor and everything into that, I do want to get something out of it if I can. So it's not always a lost cause. Sometimes they do recover.
Is there any concern with that disease spreading from the seed up the plant as it grows? Pea shoots, they're going to grow fairly tall for most people, the way they're going to harvest these. If you're cutting above that, do you think you're safe?
Yeah, I've never, I've thought about this a bit. I've not really seen evidence of that. I usually find a disease in microgreens is often near the soil surface like that, like anything that's affecting the growth of the crop is near the soil surface. And so there often is nothing up top because it doesn't grow in the case of the peas. Or the stuff that does grow, you might see some brown at the bottom, but it's something pretty nice at the top. And so the question is, if it's present up top, it's not having an effect. And knowing the intensity with which these infections do affect crops and prevent growth, my intuition is that we're not seeing that in that upper part of the crop.
What about as the crop grows? Is there a more of a home-free zone? If you think about the stages of growing a crop like peas, Stage 1 is they are covered for germination. Stage 2 is they're uncovered until you start to see some green shoot emerge. And let's say stage 3 is that green shoot grows up to size. One thought I might have looking at this is your highest risk point is when they're covered because there's no airflow, there's a high concentration of moisture there. And that's when disease is going to strike. Once you get past that, you're a little more home free because now airflow is introduced. You can observe it. You can interact with it a little bit more. Possibly then you're applying a hydrogen peroxide solution or something like that to the surface, which you couldn't do easily if they were stacked. What are your thoughts on when disease occurs? Is there a safe zone, or is it likely to occur at the soil surface regardless of one of these stages?
Yeah, so in general, your most likely source, as you've talked about, is during the germination stage. And the peas are a perfect example. Once you uncover that tray, it is not spreading anymore. I've never seen a tray go from like a little bit to spreading through the whole tray once it's been uncovered. So yeah, I think that airflow and probably the light as well are making a difference. So this is for the types of disease that show up early in the process. There are diseases and problems that can arise later in the process, even though they appear to be a little less common. And so what I'm going to do here is what we both know is Cigar had problems not just with peas, but with radish. And he was seeing brown spots on his radish leaf. And I've seen brown spots like this on some of my sunflower. And these are something that don't really appear in the germination stage, because the leaf often isn't emerged yet. The leaf is still in the hull, and it isn't until it's uncovered that the leaf gets a chance to open up and pop that hull off and start to grow. And so this is a case where we may not see something until the later stages, or it comes at the later stages. And this is hard to know whether it was there and it's just manifesting once it's been uncovered, or it's something that comes in when it's uncovered. Now with what we were looking at with the peas, this is more mold or a fungus that's coming in and doing the damage. My recollection is when we're seeing those little spots on the leaves, it's often a virus. And so it's a different type of infection that's affecting the plant in a different way. And this is something where we see maybe it's not slowing down growth or not prohibiting growth like the mold is. So you still get a crop. But the challenge here is you may not get a very good looking crop. And when we had this on our sunflower, we just found like it never looked good. Like there were lots of little brown spots or black spots on the leaves that, it just made it not look as appealing as before. And so this is something that wasn't really manifested until late in the growth, but we were never really sure whether or not it was something that came early or came later. Now, most likely, this is something that came with the seed, and viruses are very, 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 very small. And so it's something that we're probably not controlling viruses with our hydrogen peroxide or Sanitate or even bleach sanitation. It's just not an effective way of getting to them. Most of the sanitizing we do with seed, even though I think we see benefits from the plant disease point of view, is to control potential human pathogens on the seed. So I think viruses are something we do see later and probably come within the seed or start early in the process, but don't manifest until later.
Which is very similar to what we see in humans with infections. A bacterial infection you could treat with antibiotics. A viral infection you can't. You just deal with the symptoms. Antibiotics don't work on that.
Yeah, and I think there's potentially, when you look at a virus, there might be like, what are the conditions that allow that virus to do well, and what are conditions that might, slow it down. And so once again, I just stick to the basic principles of good airflow, getting the right amount of light, the humidity, the right amount of moisture, just to give the seed the optimum conditions it needs, and hopefully not giving, something else. The challenge is, if we look at it from a fungal or even a bacteria point of view, I don't know how much this applies to viruses, probably a little less, but, the conditions that are really good for germinating seed are also really good for spreading, for a pathogen or any microbe to flourish as well. It's warm, it's moist, there's a lot of food there. These are perfect conditions for spreading disease and for plant growth.
What might a seed company know about this? So you buy from a reputable seed source, let's say like Mums in Saskatchewan. Would it be fair to say, call them up? Are they seeing problems with this seed? Are they doing any sort of testing to test for pathogens on the seed prior to selling it? Would they have any information at all? Is it worth going back to the seed supplier to say, hey, I'm seeing this. Did you see anything, or do you know of anything that might be causing this being seed related?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And it's actually quite a big question. If I was to give a humorous response, analogy might be you call up an automobile manufacturer and go, do you guys have anything about these exploding fuel tanks, or this electrical problem that's shorting out different cars? And I think our conspiracy theorist minds are like, they know, but they've done the math, and they're just going to take some hits, and hopefully no one dies. But even if someone dies, financially they're still going to come out on top. You never know is the answer there. That said, I think seed companies, and especially the smaller scale seed companies, which can still be pretty big, their success comes from selling quality seed to their customers. And, if you are repeatedly buying seed from a company and it is repeatedly getting disease, it is repeatedly not growing well, you are going to stop buying seed from that company. And if that company is your only reliable source of seed, you are going to cease operating. It's really as simple as that. If it ends up, I need to bring their seed, but I need to bring it in from overseas, the shipping and exchange and import means it's 5 times the cost. The math does not work out. It's not going to happen. So a seed company, like any business, wants to provide a good product. The seed company, however, is not producing the seed. The seed company, in most cases, is buying that seed on the open market. That seed is a commodity. And so there are sort of multiple levels of interaction where we can ensure seed quality. So when we look at, and I'll revert to sprout language here, and in Canada, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency considers microgreen sprouts, and I really still take that perspective. We can get into that a bit after if it makes sense. And we're going to treat them like sprouts. And so, as we've talked about many times, the most likely source of a pathogen in a sprout is on the seed, and that is why we go through the sanitation process. So that's actually the last process we go through in order to try to avoid disease. The step before that, when you're buying sprouting seed, is that the seed company that is bringing in the seed is testing the lots of seed as they come in. They're going to test it for specific diseases that are most likely to show up and are known to infect seeds and infect humans. And the 3 we look at most frequently is E. coli, Salmonella, and Listeria monocytogenes. So that's our second barrier. But the first barrier is actually what is just known as good agricultural practices. And this kind of comes up in conversation when people talk about, can I grow my own seeds for sprouting and microgreen? Well, technically you can, but do you have the knowledge and know-how and equipment in order to grow, harvest, and process those seeds using good agricultural practices? And that's going to be from, even if we go further back, sourcing seed that hopefully was grown with good agricultural practices, planting that seed, knowing you're growing it for the sprouting or microgreens industry, so being very mindful of manures that you're applying, when you're applying them, what the likelihood is of a pathogen getting from the soil onto the plant and then into the seed. And then when you're harvesting that seed, how are you harvesting it, handling it so it's not contaminated during that process? So we kind of worked backwards there because we see it at the sanitation end as a grower, but most seed companies, I would say, from my experience, that are selling seed for microgreens are testing that. And I know Mums does, and if you whenever I've bought seed from them, they will talk about We've tested it. It's come back pretty good. We're doing trials of it ourselves. So they're growing seed out in consistent conditions all the time. And they're seeing variability, of course. And then they're also getting constant feedback from different customers. We used to buy seed by the pallet load from mums, and we used to think, I still think it's pretty good, a pretty good chunk of seed, which makes us a good customer. But there's other companies that are buying truckloads of seed from mums. So if something goes wrong, mums is going to know it. So that feedback is really important to the seed company. And what I found with mums in particular, because it's someone I've bought a lot of seed from, I will, as I'm checking in about new seed or the next lot of seed, I'll ask, like, how is seed growing? What kind of feedback are you getting from this seed? And the interesting thing about that is it's going to be really variable. And so I might really like a seed, and then I'll call and they'll be like, yeah, it's funny, a lot of growers aren't really happy with this. Or there might be a seed that we've got that really just is not working in our system. And they're like, yeah, like one of our growers just said it's the best seed they've ever seen. And so it really speaks to the system again and how you're growing it, and that being a factor. So it's really important, to have a dialogue with your seed company and get to know what their processes are, how they collect that feedback, how well they respond to it. And I've actually asked, I know a few people that are owning or managing seed companies in North America. And as they get into microgreens production, I've asked them, like, are you testing seed? They're like, yeah, we do. Like, we test our microgreen seed for human pathogens. We know the importance of this because they also know it brings them credibility as a seed company. So I think you've got to make sure you're doing what you can on your end. And then, you want to check, and you could do this regularly. Keep the seed company accountable. Like, hey, I know you guys are doing regular testing. How did this lot turn out? I'm finding a lot of disease on this seed. And that might be something that they missed, or it might be just a reaction or a dynamic between that seed and your system. I've given this example before where, I had tested some seed. It tested really good. So I bought a lot of seed. It was the biggest lot of seed I had ever bought, and actually asked if they would hold another pallet for me because we couldn't store it and couldn't afford it, and planted out 70 trays of that seed. And my process is germinate them, leave them alone, and just uncover them. But for whatever reason, I went in one day and just took a look under one of the trays to see how they were doing. And the whole thing was covered with this green mold. And I nearly lost it, like, considering the loss of this potential crop, the amount of seed we had. And it was one of the few moments that I had panicked. And so in that case, really got into like, rescue mode, using bleach, using hydrogen peroxide, whatever we used at the time to make sure we controlled it. So when it was uncovered, it was still growing. And we're doing this with every batch. But after I think about a 6-week period, it went away. And it wasn't because we were sanitizing the seed, because it's always new seed. And so what I think happened is that particular batch of seed brought in a particular microbe, which, having been introduced to the system, did not have an adversarial microbe within that to control it. It really took off. It appeared as this sort of epidemic of disease, but eventually the ecology within our greenhouse system adapted, and things that could control this other microbe started to grow because now there was something for them to feed on. And after 6 weeks, it went away. We didn't have to sanitize. We didn't have to do any of that stuff. It was just back to business as usual. So it gets really complex when something gets brought in like that there's no way really for the seed company to know how a seed is going to react in your system. So this comes back to the level of responsibility and observation you need to have in order to, mitigate these problems. That's probably the longest answer I've ever given to a question in all the years we've done this.
Well, it's a good one. And a lot of this can be confusing. I know people have a lot of questions when it gets into growing microgreens around regulations and what do I have to do, what don't I have to do, and disease comes in. So I'd rather err on the side of being thorough, so people have more information so they can ask better questions or at least think about these things and look for that information locally.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you elaborate a little bit upon one thing we were talking about before the recording, and you mentioned it here a little bit, of the idea between how microgreens are viewed in Canada and the US with new regulations around FSMA and what that means for a grower in both countries? How are they going to want to think about this?
So in Canada, microgreens are considered sprouts by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, the CFIA, even though I will say there is nowhere written down where it says that, which is really intriguing. There's no documentation, but if an inspector comes in, that's what they consider microgreens. Now, in Canada, we don't have regulations regarding microgreens production. We have guidelines, which means here's what we recommend you do. And those guidelines were developed in part with industry. And so they're relevant and they're good. Like it's, in many ways, it's your standard operating procedure. And sometimes you can look at those guidelines and just be overwhelmed. But generally, and we've talked about this, you adapt those guidelines to work for your system so you have a high level of accountability. Saying you weren't aware of the guidelines or just decided not to follow the guidelines is not a legitimate defense if something does go wrong and, you lose a huge crop and want to make an insurance claim, or if somebody gets sick from eating your product because there was a pathogen present. So that's the state in Canada, and I think if you're just doing a good job of following those guidelines or understanding them and adapting them to your system, you're going to be in a good position. We do have a Safe Food for Canadians Act, which is very similar to the Food Safety Modernization Act in the U.S. So there is some change. And I have been talking with some other industry folks here in Canada about maybe looking at a revision of those guidelines to update them to make them a little more modern. And there might be some benefits and challenges to growers because of that. So I've designed my system and my teaching and workshops and consults based on that model, which is a very, what I would call a conservative high accountability model. Let's call them sprouts. Sprouts have really, really high sanitation requirements. Here they are considered a high-risk food product. So if you're growing them with these things in mind and following these guidelines, you're in a really, really good position. Now, in the United States, the situation has changed over a few years, and I don't know things as well there, but my recollection was many years ago, 8 to 10 years ago, while we look at microgreens as food and potentially sprouts, it wasn't the USDA that was overseeing microgreens and sprout production. It was the FDA. And so this changed how regulations were applied. Now, with the food safety model, so in the I've always said to U.S. clients, we're going to treat them as sprouts. I'm not clear on what's happening in the U.S. I know if we treat them as sprouts, we're going to be going above and beyond what would be required for microgreens. So let's take that approach, just to be on the safe side. I think erring on the side of caution, especially in a country where liability is a huge issue, it puts the grower in a much better position, even if it adds costs to the production. So there's now the Food Safety Modernization Act in the U.S. It comes into play in stages, but a lot of it is already applicable. And where a lot of the staging comes in is dependent on the size of your operation. So under these acts, microgreens are not considered sprouts. They are considered a distinct commodity, and they are considered covered produce, so produce grown under cover. So this means the guidelines, regulations, whatever exist around sprouts do not apply to microgreens. Now, a lot of people might hear this and go, fucking great. I don't need to sanitize my seed anymore. I don't need to worry about this. I don't need to worry about that. However, I'm such a bubble burster. One of the things to keep in mind with microgreens and why I treat them like sprouts is because they're very, very similar. And I think there's two, maybe the third thing will come to mind as I go on here, two things that you're doing that are similar. So one is you are using a high density of seed. And just repeating again, the seed is your most likely source of contamination. So it's not like you're planting 10 seeds in a 1 foot row. You're planting 10 seeds in a 1.5 inch section. Seeds are really, really dense. And if there is something in there, it's easy for them to move from seed to seed. The other thing is, in both cases, you're often soaking those seed and putting them in a warm, humid environment with lots of moisture and lots of food. So if there is a pathogen there, its opportunity to grow and thrive is very, very high. So even though they are treated differently, they're very similar in that regard. Where they differ is microgreens are grown on soil, and because of that, you have a root going down and a stem going up, and there is some separation. Whereas microgreens are grown, on a home scale, you'd grow them in a jar, but on a commercial scale, you grow them in big bins or trays, and they get sprayed and maybe mixed around a lot, so things can get all mixed together. Or they have systems where there's overhead watering, and they are just washing things downward, which is a good system. And this is what I like about microgreens, where if you're watering from above, you're moving everything down, and you're moving it down into the soil, which might have a microbial effect and be able to control any pathogens that show up. It also means you're moving it away from the edible part of the plant, which you are going to separate from the roots and soil. So there are some differences that make microgreens a little less susceptible to some types of pathogens than others because of the way they're grown. Now, that said, in 2018, it might have been 2017, I'm just recalling off the top of my head, there were, within about a 5-week period, 3 cases of Listeria monocytogenes, or Listeria mono, identified in pea shoot crops in Canada. And there might have been one in the US as well. And so I don't think Listeria mono had been on the radar in the same degree that E. coli and Salmonella had been because of previous outbreaks in different sprout crops. And so it is possible now that we have way more microgreens growers even than 10 years ago. It's just amazing what has happened. And we have a range of production methods and standard operating procedures around sanitation and hygiene within those companies. Whereas if you're a big sprout grower, you're all following the same rules. You're all doing everything you should. You have no choice. So it is possible that we're seeing new challenges emerge because we have a new crop coming through. We're probably seeing much more pea or sunflower or radish shoot production than we have in the past, more seed being produced, more seed being shipped. So there's a lot of factors to consider. And so we might see something like Listeria mono showing up more, and then it starts bringing in the questions like, okay, so what are these new problems, and does it make sense to go back and treat microgreens as sprouts, or do we need to think about specific best practices for microgreens that are distinct to microgreens? And as an example, in sprouts, you're not using soil, and in microgreens, you are. So some of that might be around soil. I think soil is a good potential vector, especially when you've got compost and manures involved for bringing Listeria mono into your system. And so we might want to be looking at soil testing before it comes in, or best practices to avoid something if it is there. Or it starts to make a stronger case for using a hydroponic system or a hemp mat or a kelp mat or something. So these are all things that will need to be considered as the microgreens sector continues to grow, especially the small scale operator, and new problems emerge that are beyond the scope of what already exists between microgreens and sprouts in Canada and the US.
I think one of the most common questions that I've been seeing recently is around sterilization, or sanitization is the more appropriate word, sanitization, in this process, and what is the best sanitizer to use? Hydrogen peroxide comes up a lot. There's commercial sanitizers out there. Knowing these regulations, knowing that, I'd say your macro philosophy here is be as food safe as possible, regardless of what the regulations say. When new growers come to you, or people that are having disease pressure, and you get into the idea of sanitization, what do you recommend in terms of a sanitization agent or sanitizing agent?
So just to acknowledge your earlier point, it's really, and I'm glad you named this, distinguishing sanitizing from sterilizing. We are always sanitizing. So sterilizing would be killing everything, like whether it's living or it's in a dormant state that should come out later. And in order to sterilize something, like the only, as far as I can recall, like the only really accepted method of sterilizing things, especially for medical use, is with an autoclave, where you've got high temperature, high pressure, and you've got time. Like even boiling something for 30 minutes, like it's still just a type of sanitation. So that's really important to understand, that we are sanitizing things to kill bacteria or other microbes that are present, but not their dormant forms, which may emerge later. So we've kind of got what I would say three basic sanitizers. There's three, we'll call them the status quo sanitizers. So we've got good old-fashioned bleach or sodium hypochlorite, which is a very, very effective sanitizer. We use it, people use it at home. We've been using it for decades, if not centuries. I don't know the whole history of bleach, but it's very, very effective. That said, it's very, very powerful. It off-gases. There are environmental issues with bleach, probably in the production of bleach as well. And if you think about where it ends up, it's going to get flushed down something, so either into the ground or into a sewer or into your plumbing in some way. So it's not like it just disappears and everything is fine. And bleach is it's very potent. And then with something like bleach, you've got to look at what is the concentration you're using. The recommended rate for using bleach on seeds, which is absolutely fine, and in fact, there are bleach recommended rates for using bleach directly on produce, which is very common. But for in Canada, it's 2,000 parts per million bleach, and I can't recall what that is per liter, but it's not a lot, but it's a noticeable amount. In the U.S., it's 20,000 parts per million, which is, I believe, the required level of bleach you need to use, or a level high enough that you have demonstrated that is effective through laboratory testing, or there's some wording there. So 20,000 parts per million bleach is something like 3 parts water to 1 part bleach. It's very, very high. And so it's very potent, and I think you've got a lot of environmental issues to consider there. That said, bleach is effective, and it is very, very cheap. And so it's a very appealing option, both as a seed sanitizer and as a general sanitizer for surfaces. So, so that's what makes bleach appealing. So the second option would be hydrogen peroxide, or H2O2, which I think we're used to hydrogen peroxide in about a 3 to 5% solution in the little bottles we get from the pharmacy for dealing with cuts and whatnot. And the great thing about hydrogen peroxide is it just basically breaks down into water. It breaks down fairly quickly. And so in terms of its environmental impact, it's definitely lessened. However, you're not buying large volumes of hydrogen peroxide at 3% in order to use it. You're going to buy it in concentrated form, and usually at about 30%. And so you're diluting that. You're basically mixing your own sanitizer in that case. And in doing so, getting a little bit of hydrogen peroxide on you can damage your skin. So you need to have good safety protocols in place in order to be handling it. So a third, I think, becoming more common, and maybe this is just in my experience in the organic world, and I'll add here that you can no longer use bleach or sodium hypochlorite in Canada, and I'm going to guess in the US, for sanitizing microgreens, any seed. You cannot use it. You can still use it as a surface sanitizer, I believe, but you cannot use it for your seed. So you have to have something else. So hydrogen peroxide is an option, but another one is peracetic acid or peroxyacetic acid, which is a combination of hydrogen peroxide and acetic acid, which is which is vinegar basically. And you can make your own. I know some companies do that, and so you're going to need very good protocol for that. Or you can buy peracetic acid in a commercial form. And there's a few products on the market from the same company, and the one we use at the Food Peddlers is called Sanitate. And so it's a peracetic acid. There's another one called Oxidate. There's a few different ones. And I can't recall, I think the difference is the proportions of hydrogen peroxide and acetic acid, and then like another combination of them mixed in with that. So it's the chemistry is beyond my understanding. And so it's a mix there, and it's once again it's fairly concentrated, so you're diluting that, and so you need to handle it well. But it's been shown to be very effective for organic producers, and once again it's breaking down into something more benign than bleach is. So I think it's a good environmental option, and depending on your dilution rate, is a lot more cost effective than hydrogen peroxide, at least in my experience so far. You can often source it at an agricultural supply store, so it's something that is fairly common there. Now, the fourth potential way of sanitizing your seed, which is a very valid method, is with heat. And you could do that with hot water, or you could do that with steam, or a combination of hot water, steam, and pressure. There's different methods out there. And I have used a little bit of hot water as part of sanitizing. So it's another option as well. I think the trick there is just making sure you've got the temperature high enough to be effective, but not so high that it's going to damage the seed. And there is a bit of a sweet spot in there. So I think it's around, I'm not even going to actually give a temperature because I can't remember the range, but it's hotter than you are likely to get out of your tap, even a very hot tap. So it is something you would need to heat up with an external source. So you've kind of got those four options, and you can do some combinations of them. And then you could sort of look at, I think, and this is probably where you're going, so is looking at just acetic acid and using vinegar, or using something like another thing that comes to mind is grapefruit seed extract. And so I think a lot of people are concerned about, like, do I need to use a chemical to clean my seeds, or what's a way that I can do this and still feel I'm making an ethical decision about how I manage my business and my crop, at the same time as meeting the regulations or guidelines that regulate or guide how this industry works. So there are a lot of things to consider there. Cost is definitely one, efficacy is one, and then actually safety is another. If you're going to use these things, there is a safety issue, even with bleach. And then availability. I live in Vancouver. I can get anything very easily, but in other locations, some of these might not be as easy to procure, so that might limit what's available, and you need to know all your options so you can make the best of choice based on what's available to you.
One of the sanitizing agents you mentioned there was hydrogen peroxide, and I visited a farm where they would spray all of their crops after unstacking. So unstack, lay them all out on tables. They've all sprouted. They would spray it with a water hydrogen peroxide solution from a backpack sprayer to look to prevent disease. Do you think that's a necessary step, or a step that growers should look at? Or is it something you take on only if you're seeing problems?
It is something I take on only if I'm seeing problems. My approach, and not to be too reductionist, is I want to do the minimal amount of work and have the minimum amount of input to get the optimum or maximum output. I've never seen a need to do that. One, it's another piece of labor, and two, it's another cost. It's another chemical you're bringing in. And if I don't need to do that, I'm not going to do it. I would rather have good practices overall, such as sanitizing the seed, sanitizing all my other stuff, which kind of needs to be done anyways, really good airflow in order to avoid those stages. Something like hydrogen peroxide or bleach, like, they're non-selective. They kill everything. And so the idea of trying to create a more sanitary or sterile environment, which we often criticize in the organic food production world, I don't think is a great option. I look to sanitize things enough to just prevent disease spread, prevent the risk of moving pathogens from one part of the production system to another. But the idea of using something like that during production as routine at that stage, to me, it's an unnecessary step, unless for some reason you're seeing repeated disease, you've not been able to control it. Maybe it's just you're in an environment with really, really high humidity or something, and no matter what you do. But if you're growing microgreens, you're probably in a system that has a decent level of environmental control. So that's, I think, the most important place to go to first. There's another aspect of, and it's not to say I don't use those things at times, but I use them when I have a problem that is going to jeopardize the ability of the crop to mature. So I gave the example of having disease trays that I sprayed to make sure they actually got uncovered and would grow. But I wouldn't spot spray if I saw little bits of like the pea mold, for example. Like there's a little bit of disease there, that's totally fine. We're not going to add this extra step. The other thing with hydrogen peroxide and all these things is, and I've learned this in a few different ways, is they not only have an effect on pathogens, but they have an effect on newly developing cells within plants. And so if you're spraying it on an emerging plant in the germination stage, there's a lot of cellular growth, and you'll actually get a little bit of damage to the plant through that spraying process. Now, one spray is probably okay. You're probably not going to do much damage, but multiple sprays could have an effect because you're potentially damaging new cellular growth. So I'm just, it's hard to know because of that situation, but having seen a number of systems and grown in a few different systems myself, I've never really seen a need for that. And it's analogous to, like, I've never seen the need to uncover a tray during germination and water it. Like, it's just these steps that I think people like being engaged and involved with their crops. But my general rule I found is the less I engage with the crop, the better it's going to be, as long as all the conditions are set up in the beginning.
Along the idea of minimizing steps, are there certain seeds you focus on sanitizing and the others you just don't worry about? Obviously, you're not going to sanitize seeds that get that mucus type coating on them, like a basil, but things like radish. Is there any point in sanitizing that, or are you really looking at the crops that you are soaking overnight to start?
I have to be careful how I answer this. I think we should probably sanitize all of our seed before sowing. That said, there are some challenges with that. So I'll backtrack a little bit. And if I recall correctly, in the 1970s, it was an outbreak of E. coli on a radish sprout crop that really started the concern over pathogens and sprouts, which if I recall, was probably an outside contaminant from nearby operations. But I think considering sanitizing all seed to some degree is a very good prudent measure to take. Now, some seed is the large seeded crops like pea, sunflower, wheatgrass, buckwheat. There's actually relatively few, are pretty easy to sanitize because you can get them wet, dump them on a tray of soil, and spread them quite easily. They're well adapted for that. Stuff that's smaller, we'll say like the brassicas, and there's dozens and dozens of brassicas, basil, things like that. You can sanitize them, and there's two ways to look at it. We'll leave basil out because of the mucus. Same thing with quinoa and a few others. So you can sanitize them in the same way of putting them in a sanitizing solution, rinsing them, draining them, all that stuff. And then in order to sow them, you would dry that seed because they're small seeds. It's really easy to sow them by sprinkling them, and it's really hard to sow them by spreading them evenly across the soil. And so it's an extra step. You're doing all the sanitizing, but then you need to dry it to get it into that dry state in order to sprinkle it. that's a bit of a pain. The sort of shortcut to that is to sow your seed by sprinkling it onto the soil surface and then giving it a spray with hydrogen peroxide. And so despite all the other things I just said about the other company spraying hydrogen peroxide at uncovering, what we're doing at this point is we're sanitizing the seed specifically. And I'm just going to keep reiterating this point that the seed is your most likely source of contamination. And it's also a food source for any pathogen that might come in on it. So moisture and warmth in that seed create really good conditions. And so the reason we want to soak it is because you totally immerse the seed and all the sides of the seed get exposed. We actually do a lot of agitation during that process, and so it can really get in between any nooks and crannies, especially something that might have some texture to it, like a pea seed or a sunflower or corn even. But by at least spraying, say seeding something and then spraying it, we are taking at least a measure of precaution to reduce any pathogens that might be present. So your decision on whether or not to do that with any crop, I think, should really be related to partially what your capacity is, but really what is the size of the operation you are doing. How much control do you have over where the product goes and being able to monitor quality and being able to do a recall? The food peddlers, like all the customers are within biking distance, for example. So it's not like we're shipping across a border or shipping to other cities. And once you start getting on that scale, your level of accountability really, really increases. And the sort of analogy I use there is, you can make jam at home in your kitchen and sell it at the farmer's market. You still need to use good practices to do that because people can get sick, but it's a legitimate way for small businesses to sell things locally. As soon as you want to start selling that jam across a border, all these other things come into effect in terms of accountability and traceability and things like that. So these are all things I'm taking into consideration. And the way the food peddlers worked is the bigger we got, the more steps we put in place to have a higher level of accountability, which is interesting. As you get bigger, more expenses come in. That sort of offsets the increased revenue you might get. So there's a certain scale you need to grow in order to get ahead of those additional costs, which is a whole other subject. I think you need to think about a number of things with how you sanitize, to what degree and what types of crops you sanitize.
Yes, I think you can wrap this one up with just sanitize, sanitize, sanitize. The seeds, your trays, your environment. If you do that, you have good airflow, disease pressure will be there at times, but you're at least doing everything you can to minimize it as much as possible.
Yeah, and I think maybe someone's listening to this and they haven't grown microgreens and they're thinking this is a bit excessive, or they're growing microgreens on a small scale and thinking of scaling up and thinking it's a bit excessive. But really everything we're talking about is a very standard practice. And I've used the analogy before of a commercial kitchen. Before agriculture, I worked in the restaurant industry in both kitchens and as a bartender. And you spend a lot of time cleaning and sanitizing things. You're dealing with food and you're selling it to the public. And so in a kitchen, kitchens can get crazy busy and crazy dirty and messy, but you do a huge cleaning on that kitchen every single day. At the end of every shift, everything gets washed. Everything goes through the dishwasher. And then once a month, you start pulling stuff out and cleaning behind and doing everything else. So this isn't some sort of microgreen specific thing. This is standard practice, going on a limb here, in developed countries that has really helped improve health overall. And at times it can be excessive and seem a little bit much. But think about how very seldom that you get sick because of food-related illnesses. A lot of that maybe is just from washing our hands, which is amazing, but there's a lot of steps in place that keep us healthy. And all we're doing here is talking about some of those things as they relate to microgreens, but they are very common in all aspects of society relating to food.
There you have it, Chris Thoreau on growing microgreens and dealing with disease issues. I really hope this episode helped. If you have more questions related to disease, specific to your context, feel free to reach out to Chris. He does consulting, and he's happy to help you work through issues that you might be having when it comes to growing microgreens and disease. And if you want to learn more from Chris and learn about the whole business of microgreens, check out the Growing Your Microgreens business course using the link below. That's a brand new, completely overhauled and updated course that Chris designed, taking you through everything that you need to know to start and run a profitable microgreen business. From soil to how to grow to sanitation to regulations. That course is now fully updated with a lot more content added. You can register for the course or see some sample content from the course using the link below. That's all for this one. Thanks for listening. Until next time, be nice, be thankful, and do the work.